Hi everyone, I'm Bob Ward, reporter here at Boston 25, and I'm joined here with Elyse Hershon for this Brian Walsh trial podcast that we have been doing for several weeks now, from even before the trial began. And today, I think you can call it Judgment Day for Brian Walsh, because today in a courtroom in Dedham, Brian Walsh was sentenced, and what an interesting event it was. You know, at least it was kind of a foregone conclusion because he was convicted of murder in the first degree, and that carries that mandatory life no parole. But there were victim impact statements. The judge had something to say, which we're going to get into in just a second. But it was still interesting to watch how all of this played out. Just your general observation of what you saw today.
I think this case is unique because people kept looking to Brian Walsh for some sort of reaction or emotion. They heard his voice throughout the trial. We talked about no one ever heard Anna's voice directly. She was present, obviously, throughout the trial. People were very focused on Brian Walsh. People were focused on him today at the sentencing, looking for some sort of reaction. There wasn't much of one.
No.
And even though the outcome was set in statute, life without parole is mandatory for all first-degree murder convictions, I think everyone was curious to see and wanted to see what the other victims, and there were other victims in this case, Anna's family and friends. So I think people were wanting to hear from them who didn't testify in the trial, and then the judge said her piece.
When Brian Walsh walked into the courtroom, I was looking at his face, and to me, he looked worried. He looked scared. He was not the self-assured guy that I've seen every other day on the trial. So he walked in, and one of the things that he had to do as he walked into the courtroom, he had to walk right past Anna Walsh's sister. Now, we have not seen Anna Walsh's sister at all in the media. She lives in Canada, from what we understand. She grew up in Serbia with Anna and their mother. And she got on the stand today, and she read a prepared statement, but I thought it was very emotional in a way to hear her speak of what the last 3 years have been like and how this murder has impacted the entire family. We have a clip. Let's play that now.
The most painful part of this loss is knowing her children must now grow up without their mother's hand to hold. They now face a lifetime of milestones, big and small, where her absence will be deeply and painfully felt. Because of the circumstances of my sister's death, we were denied the opportunity to say a final goodbye and to observe our customs, adding a layer of profound, unfinished grief to our loss.
All right, so that was Anna Walsh's sister. What did you think? What kind of impression did she leave you with?
As a defense attorney, victim impact statements are one of the most difficult things to sit through, despite what people think. Defense attorneys have hearts and we have feelings, and we're very empathetic, not just towards our clients, but towards people that are involved in the cases. It's very sad all around. It was heartbreaking to hear her say. She used a lot of very descriptive words about not these children are going to grow up and not be able to hold their mother's hand, and then talking about the emptiness and how they were robbed of saying goodbye to, sister and on behalf of her mother as well as the daughter. So it's hard to sit through. It's hard. I'm sure it was very hard for those defense attorneys to sit through. Brian Walsh didn't show too much emotion in terms of there were no tears, there was no wiping of the eyes. We've really not seen that from him, not only in this trial, but not in any of the interviews he gave, not in the times where he was lying to police and knew that Anna was dead and leading them on a wild goose chase to find her. So that certainly played into this a lot.
I should mention Elyse is a criminal defense attorney here in Boston. I should have mentioned this in the intro, so if you're just joining us for the very first time with this episode, she specializes in homicide cases and has been a part of 17 homicide cases. So we're really relying on Elyse's perspective on this, her experience on being at the defense table when events like this take place. So we heard publicly from Anna's sister, but the judge also mentioned that there were letters that she read from other people We believe that she read something from their children, from Brian and Anna's children, but we don't know what that letter says because that has been sealed. There have been some other people, friends of Anna's as well, from what we understand, also being allowed to say something through a written statement.
Absolutely, and it can be cathartic for a witness and victims to relay what their feelings are, whether or not they were able to testify in the trial, and to be able to put it in writing and give it to the judge. The Alyssa Kirby and I believe her brother and sister-in-law provided statements we did not hear publicly, that there was a document on behalf of the children. I'm not sure who authored it. The children are very young. We did not hear that. And from Brian Walsh's mother, and we did not hear that statement. So there are statements that are made in court. We heard one of them. And the rest of them are for the judge to consider. It doesn't influence the judge in terms of, the judge is bound by the statute in terms of life without parole and the first-degree murder, but it's still helpful for the victims to be able to express what they think and to be able to feel like they get some closure in this, even though Anna was never found.
Judge Diane Fier really threw the book at Brian Walsh, and we're going to get into the actual sentence in just a moment, but before she got to the sentence, the numbers of the time that he's going to face in prison, she had quite a few things to say about her analysis of the evidence in this case and what he has been convicted on. Here, I want to show everybody now just a sample of what I'm talking about. And in this quote, Judge Fier is talking about the charge of disposal of a body, the dismemberment of Anna Walsh.
Your acts in dismembering your wife's body and disposing of her remains in multiple area dumpsters can only be described as barbaric and incomprehensible. You had no regard for the lifelong mental harm that your criminal acts inflicted on your then 2, 4, and 6-year-old sons, not only in taking their mother, but also, as is specific to this charge, in never being able to properly grieve that loss, to say goodbye to their mom.
So, Elyse, I thought that was pretty powerful, pretty impactful to hear from the judge. She put it all out there. She told Brian Walsh, she looked right at him and said those words.
The judge's role in a trial, they really are supposed to be an independent arbiter of the evidence and of making certain decisions. But the case goes to the jury. They're the finders of fact. So the judge, Judge Fier, and in any sentencing piece, the judge has an opportunity to express more of their opinion or less objective. So we really heard a lot of what the prosecution said echoed in Judge Fier's statement with regards to sentencing, and she really got into a lot of detail with regards to this was the evidence under each count, and she went through a lot of horrifying details and very much went against Brian Walsh, which of course he was convicted, but she showed him no mercy. I mean, there was no wiggle room with the life without parole, but the 2 other charges, the disposal of the body, that was a maximum of 3 years. She sentenced him to 2 years and 364 days to 3 years. So
it was just 1 day.
It's 1 day. So basically with a state prison sentence in Massachusetts, unless it's a life sentence or life without parole, there's 2 numbers. There's a top number, which is the maximum they can do, and then there's a bottom number. So it's a range. So a lot of times can be a 3 to 5, a 2 to 3 year, an 18 to 20 year, a 20 to life. In this case, she basically gave the max that she could under the disposal of the body, running it on and after. She could have given him 1,000 years under this. The statute doesn't allow for it, but she could have given 1,000 years. It's not going to change the fate of Brian Walsh. He's never going to see the light of day. He's never coming out of prison. He's never going to have a parole hearing. He'll never have any of that. Of course, there's an automatic right of appeal that will take a few years to get through, and there would have to be some really glaring issue to even have a shot at that, and I don't really see it.
All right, and going back to the sentencing, so he got that for the disposal of the body, it was only 3 years. You could tell she was frustrated by the fact that the legislature only allows up to 3 years. And also lying to investigators, there was an enhancement on that. because he's now been convicted of a felony. He's lying to investigators in the investigation of a felony, which is the murder of Anna Walsh. Now he's been convicted. So those two things were set aside. He was sentenced on those today. And even on that second charge of lying to investigators, she went to the max, 19 to 20 years.
Absolutely. And without a murder conviction, that maxes out at 10 years. So because it was a murder conviction here, she was able to sentence to 20. And again, it doesn't change his sentence. It doesn't change his fate. But it was for effect, and it was really to show how just horrified she was at the case and how disgusted she was with him, I think.
And then the way this was all stacked. I've been to so many sentencing where there are multiple charges, and typically all the charges run at the same time. They run concurrent. But that's not what happened here. It was, they're set up consecutively, one after the other. Now, we are talking about life, no parole, so it seems like an academic exercise, but really it's not. Why did she do that? Why is this set up the way that it is?
The judge was sending a message that and what she said very directly, there are no mitigating circumstances in this case. There's nothing in this case that should lend him any leniency, and that includes running a sentence concurrent that makes no difference whether she runs it from and after or at the same time. So she ran it on and after or from and after as consecutive sentences to send a message that this is, she's going to give the max for all of these.
Well, that message was sent loud and clear. I also want to ask you about Prosecutor Greg Conner. When he was talking about what the Commonwealth was looking to get out of sentencing, he gave some insight into the Commonwealth's thinking on the theories in the case. And where I'm going with this is he went back to those internet searches, and he talked about how those internet searches were like a roadmap for what was happening when. And I don't remember this being punched so directly in the actual trial, but the thing that struck out at me was that he was saying that if you go by those internet searches, you discover that Anna Walsh was murdered and her body was left in the house for 24 hours before he began the process of dismemberment. And he said that body was there in the same house as the 3 kids, as Brian Walsh's own mother, as the housekeeper who came by. That's where Anna was for 24 hours, and that really hit home with me.
That's, it's very descriptive. The sentencing arguments usually tap more into the emotions. The jury is, the prosecution usually presents a lot of emotional aspects to the evidence during a trial, but this was a time for them to really hit home to the judge that this is beyond the facts and beyond the evidence. This is a horrific circumstance, and just how depraved Brian Walsh is. And the judge certainly echoed that sentiment in her sentencing, but also how she wove all 3 charges together into a story about how all of this was not only premeditated, but that it was calculated with the cover-up, with the 4 hours of his interviews lying to police, showing no emotion, while Anna is already killed and he had already killed her, and lying to police, and then what he did to get rid of the body and the mother of the children, and really the impact on the children. So this, of course, became much more about what happened to Anna, but what's going to happen to the children, and the sadness all around.
Yeah, absolutely. We are starting to hear from at least one juror who was on the case. Reporters are finding the jurors now who are willing to speak, and at least one so far. Maybe by the time people get to see this, maybe other jurors will be speaking as well. But essentially, they convicted Brian Walsh in less than 6 hours. And from what we're hearing, the only thing they had to consider was this first or was this second degree murder? They didn't believe the story about Anna, the defense's story that Anna just died naturally and he found her and then he freaked out. Yeah,
I heard the juror, the recording of the juror as well. She, again, not being identified, but as a juror on the Brian Walsh case, she communicated that they never bought that this was a cover-up of an accident. And I will say that, it's impossible to know what went on behind closed doors, and obviously attorney-client privilege will continue and we'll never know. But in terms of a defense, the attorneys, yes, we're the experts, we're the advisors, we present a case, we decide on the strategy, but in order to concede any sort of involvement, so for example, to go for a manslaughter defense, the defendant has to be okay with it and has to approve that and has to be on board with it, partially because they have a right to testify in their own case, and if they're going to testify, they need to concede some sort of involvement with that defense, but also because it's their trial and they're the ones standing trial. So it's interesting to think about, did Brian Walsh handcuff them to this defense of sudden medical event because he refused to concede any involvement and acknowledge that he had a part in killing her, even if it was a mistake or an accident or some sort of fit of rage? And I think the jury, based on this juror's statements and based on my experience doing homicide trials, I think juries recognize and accept when people take accountability, even if it's for a mitigating option. So if it wasn't first degree, it was a manslaughter, they sort of respect when a defendant takes accountability. It really depends on the case. Most cases, defendants don't take the stand. In a lot of cases, it might be it wasn't him, but in this case, it really was him. It was just what degree of culpability, and probably Brian Walsh, again, not having access to the evidence, but he probably didn't want to concede manslaughter.
Diane Walsh, as you mentioned, Brian Walsh's mother, did provide an impact statement to the court. It was not read aloud, but the only hint we have of what it might have said is the judge said to the bench, from the bench, to her, that I've read your statement, and I have to tell you how you describe Brian Walsh, I cannot square with the man that I see in court in front of me right now. I tried to talk to Mrs. Walsh after the proceeding today, after her son was sentenced, but no, she was talking. She just kept avoiding me and all the other members of the media as quickly as she could. Brian Walsh himself was led out of the courthouse about an hour after he was sentenced, and he came out and he was asked a couple of questions were thrown to him, but he didn't say anything, and he just got into the van, and then that van took him to wherever they take him, as they prepare him for the rest of his life in maximum security prison. You just wonder what's going through the mind of someone like that as they're being taken away. He's a middle-aged man, and the way things are stacked now, if things don't change legislatively or an attorney finds some gross negligence and he's entitled to a new trial, the way it stands right now, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison without even that possibility of a parole hearing. That's pretty heavy stuff.
That's correct. And I think a lot of times if someone's convicted of first-degree murder, there's as a defense attorney, you argue that certain minimum mandatory sentences can be inhumane because it doesn't recognize that there are variances, even in a first degree, that there could be mitigating factors in there. The judge was very clear that there are no mitigating circumstances or factors in this case. He did what he did, and it was horrific, and he deserves every day of that sentence, and Judge Fier made that clear.
These sentences, life no parole convictions, they're always subject to at least a review, right? Is it an automatic review or is it an automatic appeal?
It's an automatic right of appeal, so Brian Walsh will be likely assigned appointed counsel, appellate counsel. There's just a shortage of lawyers everywhere, and it's probably going to take, it might take a year or more for him to actually even be appointed a lawyer, and then the appeals process will happen. So it will be a few years before he gets a shot to appeal this.
Wow, interesting. So I was going to ask you what the grounds might be, but that's not really fair because that's up to another legal counsel to take a look at the whole file and see what they find inside. So every case is different, and we don't know what they're going to find. Elyse, thank you so much for joining me during this whole process. It's been a couple of weeks, and we've done, 4 or 5 of these podcasts, and I find it so interesting to have your insight to understand what looks to so many of us as an open and shut case really is not, and why things play out the way they do. Your insight has been invaluable. And I've been covering this case since the search for Anna Walsh 3 years ago. Remember in Jerusalem Road, there was a fire that mysteriously started, and people thought there might be something happening, and Anna might be in their old house, which had suddenly caught fire. Ended up being totally unrelated. But I remember as a reporter on a news day how crazy that day was. And now here we are 3 years later. We have so many answers in this case. We know what happened essentially to Anna Walsh. We probably will never know exactly how she died, but we do know that her husband, Brian Walsh, has been held accountable and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Elyse, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a fascinating case.
It really has been, and thank you all for joining us. Take care.